Good evening, and just a little bedtime reading from my book, For the Love of Vietnam, A War, a Family, a CIA Official, and the Best Evacuation Story Never Heard. October 1974. South Vietnam doesn't have 4 seasons, it has 2, very hot and rainy, and hot and dry. As the rainy season came to a close in October 1974 and the weather cooled slightly, the intensity of the war and peace picked up. Congress had confirmed only $700 million in support for the fiscal year ahead, which sentenced the South Vietnamese Army, otherwise known as the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, the ARVN, to desperate half measures in their attempt to defend against the escalation of northern forces. Additionally, the Southern Army was suffering under the disadvantage of the corruption of its own leadership. The situation under President Thieu's administrations had become so dysfunctional that its effects reached right down to the very infantrymen. Often, the South Vietnamese troops were unable to feed their families, and morale suffered greatly. Due to the exploitation of the ever-dwindling resources by the officers, even artillery support sometimes had to be paid for by the soldiers. As long as security was good and living standards decent, the people tolerated corruption and inefficiency in government, South Vietnamese politician Nguyen Ngoc Hue said. These defects are becoming less and less tolerable as security and living standards decline and numerous large-scale scandals bring into the open the rotten character of the leaders of the regime. If Thieu continues to govern with the support of corrupt and incompetent men while rejecting any true dialogue with other non-communists, it will be difficult for South Vietnam to win the struggle against communists, whether it is fought militarily or politically. The political situation did take a sudden and unexpected turn. On October 8th, the North announced its refusal to deal with Thieu. They demanded a new leader if there was going to be any further talks about a negotiated settlement in which North and South could share a government. President Thieu responded by firing 4 members of his cabinet, demoting 400 field-grade officers, and removing 3 of his 4 regional commanders. His conciliatory attitude didn't last long, however, as he quickly did an about-face and slapped new controls on the press and warned opposition groups that they continued to agitate at their peril. His methods backfired when, on the afternoon of October 10th, thousands of people took to the streets, surging past police lines to join the hundreds of journalists who were demonstrating against the government's repressive laws. Upon observing the sight of so many people agitated enough to protest, one Western journalist commented, "Thieu's really in trouble. I didn't believe it before, but I believe it now." The pressure on my father, James E. Welch, and the situation was rugged, and he came home daily, visibly worn by the weight of his task to portray the South as a desirable place to defect to. My mother wished that she could send him someplace to relax, but there was no safe place to go. "The situation here is not the best," she wrote home at the end of the month. "If the Viet Cong keep blowing up the bridges, soon we won't be able to get out of the city at all. There are several nice places one could visit in a day, and I'd sure like to go, but one always has the fear that the VC might be in the area, and they really seem to be." While my parents may have tried to keep the unrest in the city at an arm's length, just something they read about in the papers and avoided by never walking on city streets, it became very real to us in 2 ways. The first was that our cook, Hoa, was beside herself about the plight of her teenage son, Amin. He had just finished military school and was due to be deployed any day. 5 of Amin's friends had gone into battle weeks before, and only 2 returned. Hoa had already lost his father, a Frenchman, to the VC 9 years earlier. "He is such a nice 18-year-old boy," my mother wrote home, "and actually looks a lot like an American kid. At any rate, Pleiku seems to be certain death, and we are all dismayed. Hoa said if she pays the big whips 200,000 piastres, about $330, he can be assigned to the Saigon area, but she would have to sell her house to do it." My mother said that they were toying with the idea of loaning her the money, but that Amen could still be killed in battles around Saigon, though it was less likely. We are really going through a crisis of conscience, she wrote. I really don't believe in buying people off, but it's a way of life here. If one has the money, they don't have to fight. Amen survived the worst of the fighting and was included in my father's list of those he would escort out of the country. Hua declined the invitation for her family, but later fled the country on a small boat, though we never heard from her again. The second way that the unrest affected us was that on October 31st, Halloween, of course, another anti-2 protest ruined our Halloween. It started out as a normal Thursday, even if we were a little bit hyper at the thought of going to the embassy that evening for a party and for lots of candy. As we sat in our classrooms at the Phoenix Study Group on Kong Lee Street, we were unaware of the flurry of activity in the hall down the school office down the hall. We were shutting down the school, the secretary said when she got my mother on the phone. Send your driver to get your kids home. She didn't wait for a reply, but clicked right through to another call. There were nearly 100 families to reach, and time was short. Our driver, Mr. B, had to argue with the police to get past the barbed wire that they had set up around to keep protesters out of the main city streets. After much yelling, the officers finally let him through. He crept along and entered the gates of the school in line with the other cars sent to pick up the school children. The demonstration would make American headlines. The Oxnard Press-Courier in California proclaimed that riot police battle 2 protesters. Violence paralyzes Saigon. And we were right in the middle of it. I remember the confusion of that morning the way one remembers a bad dream. There had been one day earlier in the year when I had thought I'd been forgotten at the school. I'd mixed up the pickup time, thinking it was noon and not 12:30 p.m. As I'd watched the minute hand creep along on that day, the worry that I'd been left behind seeped through me like a slow poison. But on the morning of Halloween, there was no time to watch the clock. We were rushed from the classrooms to our cars in a desperate attempt to get us home safely. Mr. B drove us out of the school gates and through the throngs of people in the streets, and I peered out at the dangerous city. Struck dumb by the incomprehensible roar of discord, I was slowly beginning to realize that my understanding of the world was in shambles. That night, in an almost comical attempt to rescue the holiday, my parents felt the need to provide a veritable house of horrors, though I'm sure I'd had enough for one day. My mother sat us all down in the living room, except for Michelle, who was upstairs hiding with my father. Chris, Mike, John, Jimmy, Kim, and myself were sent upstairs one by one into a sheet-draped bedroom, veritable caverns of darkness, to trick or treat. We had fun as we scared the H out of them, my mother wrote, as if I really needed that. But I do remember getting scared to death when my father, a shriek came out of the darkness, and after I screamed, my sister flipped on the light and my dad came out from under the sheet, and all was well. And he gave me candy. He gave me Butterfingers, which I didn't really like, but once I got downstairs and nibbled it, I decided maybe it was okay after all. Happy Halloween, everyone.